Three questions for you to start with. And none of the three questions are religious. Well, maybe the first one is since you're from Kentucky, but bear with me. Question number one. This is maybe the religious one. Who is the greatest player in UK basketball history? See, that can be religious in Kentucky. We hold that pretty high. Second question. What's the hardest dish to make? Okay. Third question. Where is the best place to go? So I've asked three questions, and I think all of you can probably give an answer to that. In fact, there's probably multiple answers to all three of those questions. I would argue, or not argue, I would say that those questions would generate a lot of interest. They're thought-provoking, and they might even be tricky. Because if we ask that question, who is the greatest UK basketball player ever? There's a lot of potential answers to that question. And there's some things that would factor into it. When you make your decision, one, because that probably matters. But does it matter that they were the number one pick in the NBA draft? That's kind of important. Does it matter that it was somebody that you watched play when you were a certain age that really resonated with you? For me, it was John Pelfrey, who nobody would list as one of the best players, but I was like 10 years old when he played at UK, and he's one of my favorite. The hardest dish to make. Well, but for some of you, there's probably this that you say, well, my mama made this and I just can't do it. I have tried and tried. Anybody know anybody like that? Or it might be something that she makes the best this or he makes the best that. But you think about it, it's like, well, I've never tried to make that dish. Or maybe the last one. Where's the best place to go on vacation? Well, that's a tough question to ask, right? Because the answer is a lot of places, but there's some things that factor into it. Right? How much time do we have? I only have 1 week. Well, it's going to be hard for me to go to Australia, but that might be the answer. Well, I've got 2 weeks, but I've only got $500. Well, that's going to limit where I would be able to go. As factor in to this. They are, as we said, though, interesting, thought-provoking, but it can be a little bit tricky. See, these are the kind of questions that we ask when we want to have a conversation with somebody, right? You might say, well, what color is this? Well, it's red. Well, that's what it is. All right. Well, that eliminates the conversation. But the kind of question that you ask that generates thought, that makes people think, and it makes people bring up a question or bring up an answer that might have multiple answers is something that we're faced with on a daily basis. Let's get to what we read there in Matthew chapter 22 for just a second, because I think we see the same thing right here. Jesus was asked, what is the great commandment? Now, I think we can argue here that this is interesting, thought-provoking, and tricky, right? Because the way the question is asked lets us know that there was a number of commandments that exist. We're all familiar with the 10 commandments, right? But the Old Testament has something like 600 different commandments required to follow. So we're having to pick from 600 different places. Let's go back to UK basketball for a second. How many players have played at UK? Hundreds, maybe thousands of players. That's a hard decision. So they're asking Jesus, what was the greatest commandment? What's the greatest commandment? Now, you got to think a little bit on this, because there are some things that are commandments that you might say, well, I don't really think much about that one. But this one, I do think a lot about. So the question is proposed to Jesus, but it's proposed in a sense to go to the third part, which is tricky. What they wanted Jesus to say was something that would generate an argument on the other side. They wanted Jesus to say that the greatest commandment is to ... whatever it is. And then somebody on the other side could say, nope, that's wrong. It's right here. Jesus, as he was wont to do in the New Testament, answers it in a way that sort of supersedes or overrides a potential argument. Answers that we might have thought of. We might have said something like, sacrifice, Maybe that's the best command. We might have thought that something like that to give. Or maybe because Jesus did this, we saw this a few weeks ago, observing those feasts. That was important. That was a very important part of their religion. See, there's many answers that you could think of. You might could think of something else from the Old Testament or from the New Testament that would have been an important answer for this. There was room, perhaps, to argue. But Jesus gives a response that can't be debated, right? And as we talk about it, then not only does Jesus go a little further, he says it's also important that you love your neighbor. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. If you see what's on the screen here, this should be a term that you are familiar with, especially if you had kids that was alive anywhere from about 67 through about 1997, somewhere in there. Who recognizes this question that's on the board? Some of you probably recognize the font of the question that's on the board right now. Some of you might be thinking about puppets right now on this. I think about sweaters. That's just me. I was looking as hard as I could to try and put something on the screen that was like a closet full of sweaters, but I just couldn't find what I wanted. Some of you are thinking, some of you who worked during this time period think, I have no idea what this person's talking about right now. This is from the Mr. Rogers show, right? This is from Mr. Rogers. And we remember how that show and the song would go there. So what we're going to talk about today, though, the question is, won't you be my neighbor? But we're going to talk about who is my neighbor. Okay, we talked a little bit about this on a Wednesday night a while back, but I wanted to do this again right here. This same question that was asked by another in the Bible. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 29, a lawyer, after hearing the first and second command, asked, who is my neighbor? Turn, if you would, to Luke chapter 10 right now. This is a really good question. Who is my neighbor? We're going to start in verse 30. Luke chapter 10 and verse 30. And Jesus answered and said, this will be a story that you're familiar with. He said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell among thieves who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked, passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. Now, Jesus has another verse, but I want to pause there for just a second. Jesus asked the man in the story, in this reading here, he asked the man who had been a neighbor. In verse 36, we read then, so which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor? That's where it is. And the one that showed mercy on him was the answer given in verse 37. So at the end of then verse 37, Jesus says what? Go and do likewise, correct? So the question initially had been, who was my neighbor? When we think of the word neighbor, we think about the person next door, right? That's just the word. That's the way our language fits, is it's the person that lives next door to us. We have great neighbors, and Robert Frost said good fences make good neighbors, but neighbors are good, right? It's nice to have a neighbor that if you're gone or whatever, they can take care of something that it might be. But that's the way we have sort of described a neighbor. I've got a man and woman on one side, a man and his children on the other side, but I don't know about the person that lives 2 houses down, right? I don't know if I would call them a neighbor. There's some people around the corner that live in the neighborhood, but I don't know that I would necessarily call them a neighbor. We get into that. We sort of think about it that way. But a neighbor is anyone who is willing to help someone in need. There is no way the story that Jesus tells of the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, it does not appear that any of those people knew the man who was hurt in the story. They didn't live next door to him. They didn't mow their yard and then go over and mow the other. They were completely different people from completely different areas. But The Samaritan helped there at the end who was in need. Mr. Rogers started every episode by saying, hello, neighbor, right? Now, he's talking into a camera in a studio. I believe it's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was where it was made. But he's talking into a camera in a studio. And I'd imagine there was probably 15 or 20 other people that were there doing various things, but he wasn't talking to them. He was talking to generations of little kids who were at home. And in many cases, generations of little kids who needed a neighbor right there, people that he was able to help. He was showing comfort to and kindness to and all of this. But he said, hello, neighbor. He didn't say hello to the kid who lives on the right side of my street and the left side of my street, but it was to all of these kids right here. If we want to have good neighbors, we got to be the good neighbor. That's when we have to consider who is my neighbor. So the question then, what does it mean to love? Because that's what Jesus described when he was saying what the greatest command was. Our first idea of love is sort of this deep emotion for one another, right? Remember the first person he was in love with? He's probably 12, 14, loved that person more than anything in the world, right? If you'd said, what does it mean to love? I don't know, but I think I love her, all right? I think I love him. He is wonderful. And you're like, what's her last name? I'm not really sure. All right. So it's hard to necessarily, but we have this sort of deep emotional idea of what love would be. But as we see here, it's accurate. That's true, but it's not just complete. It's not entirely complete. The Bible describes love as not only having a deep emotion for someone, but also seeking out their highest good. Think about that for a second. Not only do I love somebody, not only am I emotionally invested with somebody, but I want the absolute best for that person as well. So now when we think about who do we love, who do we want the absolute best for? Probably our spouse, probably our children, probably people that we come in contact with, but that list may get pretty short, right? I don't even think about some of these people. I don't know that let's think about that for just a little bit. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. These aren't new verses for you. You'll know them. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself and is not puffed up. Does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That's a series of verses, 4 verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that gives us a real clear division of what is love and what is not love. And you can read those series of verses pretty regularly, and you can think, okay, these people that I come in contact with, am I considering them this way or that way? Do I love this person or do I not? Jesus said in John 15:13 that greater love has no man than what? To lay down his life for his friends. But do we have that kind of love for our neighbor? Well, let's think about what our neighbor is. Is it the man and woman that live next door to us? Yeah, I feel that way about them, but what about the other people? I don't know. Is it our people that are in contact with us right here? Yes, but what about the other people that we come in contact at work? We're going to talk about that in just a second. Greater love has no man. The Samaritan in the story, the priest and the Levite were religious leaders. They were the people who should have helped the man who was hurt. The Samaritan was a frowned upon sort of half mixed breed of people in Israel that really nobody liked the Samaritans. But the Samaritan, not only does he stop, he takes him to the inn and then also says, if you need more, I will pay more. He's not even going the first mile. He's going the extra mile there as well. Do we have that kind of love for our neighbors as well? When should I love my neighbor? This is maybe the hardest question, right? Because it's real easy to love at certain times, but it's not so easy to love in other times. Proverbs 17 and verse 17 says, a friend loves at all times. That's an interesting thought, right? A friend loves at all times. But that's easy for me because I've got a list of friends that I will love no matter what. Some of you probably have friends that have been with you since you were in school or maybe even earlier than that. You may view a sibling or something in the same way, but I would love them no matter what. And if they did something stupid, I'm still going to love them. But there's other people that we maybe struggle with that a little bit. As we already said, though, love's not a feeling or just a feeling, but also an action on our love for a neighbor. Well, first of all, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 says, when we have the opportunity. Let's read there for just a second. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Well, I can understand the household of faith part, right? Because I love all of you and I don't want anything bad to happen. I'll help you in any way that you need help. But those all on the other end gets a little trickier, right? Even the people that don't seem to care for me, I got to love them. It's a little tough, right? So the first one, when we have an opportunity, okay? Well, second, when we know to do good. James 4 and verse 17 says, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is what? The Bible says, right? To know to do good and to not do it is a sin. Think about that priest and that Levite in the story that Jesus told. Did they sin right there? They passed by on the other side. They said, I know to do good to this person, but my decision is to go over here to the other side. Third, when there's a need. Acts chapter 2 and verse 45 said they sold their possessions and divided them among all, anyone who had need. That's the earliest Christians right there. They sold their possession. I'm not advocating that you go out there and sell everything that you've got, don't have anything left, but we have stuff that we don't need, right? That's why we give stuff away. Part of the reason is to unload some stuff, but to do good, to help others when there is a need, we should strive and desire to help. There have been many times in my life that people that I know have needed help. And sometimes that need was financial. And there's been times when it's maybe been physical help. You know, they might have needed something physically. It might have been something emotionally. There's sometimes when you just got to sit down and cry with somebody. Because that may be what there's a need. That's when I got to approach it that way. Well, where? Where should I love my neighbor? First one is at home. Think about that for a second. Daniel, that doesn't make a lick of sense. I need to love my neighbor at home. I don't mean the people that live on the left and right. I mean the people in of the house. How many of you have multiple people inside of your house? Now, I need an honest answer. You ever had times when the people inside your house is going, oh, he's ready to, I don't know if I love that person or not, right? It's like, it would be better if that person was not here for right. We all have those kinds of things right now, but we have to start our love of our neighbor at home. You might say, well, that seems a little bit odd. Well, I'm going to look at Ephesians and I want to look at Titus, two different places where we can see the importance of loving our neighbor starting at home. First of all, how can I love my neighbors outside if I don't love the people that I'm in constant contact with on the inside? How many of you know somebody who seems to hate everybody? You know anybody? Your giggles. Everybody knows that, right? It's like, they hate everybody. Whatever the case might be. You know who that person is. I hope it isn't you, but you probably work with them or you live next door to them or whatever it might be. But how can we love others if we don't love the people that we're in constant contact with? Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25 says that husbands are supposed to love their wives, right? So that's one task. That's somebody at home. That's a neighbor at home that I got to learn to love. Hopefully not learn to love. I probably said that. Sorry, Mary. But I need to love that person. Husband. Titus chapter 2 and verse 4, we see it flipped around to love their husbands. So we got to have this love at home of both people sort of loving each other. But let's go a little bit further then. Ephesians chapter 6 and 4, also Titus chapter 2 and 4 again, parents are to love their children. So we've kind of got everybody within the home taken care of there, right? The husband loves the wife loves the husband, the parents love the child. Ephesians chapter 6 verses 1 and 2, children are to love their parents. So let's start at home. If I am going to love, the first people I got to love is the people that I come in contact with at home. Have you ever known a family where it seems like everybody just hates each other? That's disappointing when you see that. I've had friends, people whose houses that I've been to, it seemed like everybody there hated being with each other. And usually what would end up happening is we would almost immediately leave that house. Because who wants to sit around with 3 or 4 or 5 people that are bickering and fighting and hating each other? It's really nothing good to gain from that. But we have to start our love of our neighbor at the house. Number 2, at work. Now, that's where it gets a little tougher, right? Because the home part was easy. Most of you love your wife. You love all these people most of the time, right? But that makes sense. A little tougher when we go to work. Let's think about at work for just a second. Our coworkers are our neighbors. They don't live beside you, but you spend as much time with them as probably the real neighbor that does live beside you. And the thing is, you don't get to pick who those coworkers are, right? At work, you just got to deal with them. John chapter 13, verse 35 says, by this all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Let's talk about 3 people at work, right? Got to love the boss. Anybody ever had a boss you had to work really hard to love? Anybody ever had a good boss, one you really love? Man, ain't nothing bad. The worst thing they can say is when they're going to leave, right? All right, so you gotta love the coworkers. And that's really tough, right? The ones that come up just won't ever stop talking. Oh, don't you ever work? Go over there and do something. Why are you always talking? All right, we got to love that person right there. But here's where it gets a little tougher. Maybe also, you got to love the people that are subordinates to you. You ever been the boss? Tony, you know what I'm talking about here, right there. Those people, you have to tell them, you have to go do this. But we got to do it with love, right? We can't just slap them around, knock them around. But that's what it is. We have all of these kind of dealings. People at work, this is practical. This is stuff that we deal with on a daily basis. And it's real easy to go to work and just sort of shut the door or to shut ourselves out. I don't want to talk to any of these people, but that's not showing love toward them. That's a responsibility that we have. Number 3, where should I love my neighbor? In public. You know, the home is probably private. You know, I love all this, but in public, maybe I act totally different. Sometimes people act different depending on where the situation is. In public, Jesus said, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16, to let your light so shine before all men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. According to the story that Jesus told there about the Good Samaritan, I think we can all safely assume that was wounded, who was injured, did not know the Good Samaritan, right? But what do you think the man who was injured later on in life said about the Good Samaritan? What do you think he said about other Samaritans going forward? I would imagine that the work that was done by the Good Samaritan put a better shine, a little bit better name on all of the Samaritans that man came in contact with. Because he would have been taught, no doubt, that this is a group of people that you are not to like, that you're to hate, that you're to disagree with, or what. Wait a minute. This is a person that I think I like. I love this person, this neighbor. Wherever we are, whatever it may be, we are to love our neighbor. How do I love my neighbor? If you've noticed so far, we've went through a whole series of, every single one of these has been a question. I hope they've been thought-provoking and interesting and tricky because there are multiple answers to them along the way. But how do I love my neighbor? Well, first of all, as we read, the Good Samaritan parable tells us the showing mercy. But I want you to turn to Romans chapter 13 real quick. Paul gives another response in Romans chapter 13, in particular, verses 9 and 10. Follow along with me. Romans 13, verses 9 and 10. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, Paul says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 10, Romans chapter 13, love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Why was it that Jesus said that to love your neighbor as yourself was the second most, the important laws? He said, because on that hangs all the law and the prophet. Paul says a couple books later in Romans that love is the fulfillment of the law. If we're going to fulfill the law, as it were, I know Jesus fulfilled the law, but if we're fulfilling our Christianity, we got to love that same neighbor as well. Love compels us to tell others about the gospel. That's what Jesus was doing. And if we love our neighbor, we'll respect God's commands and teach them the truth about salvation. Why? Why should I love my neighbor? Well, first of all, God, we're taught to. We've looked at several verses this morning that tells us how we are to love our neighbors. Second, you can see here on the screen, it's the natural result of treating others the way you want to be treated. We've all heard that. Golden rule, right? Doing to others as you would hope that you would have others do unto you. Think about that for a second. You ever thought about it for a minute? If every single person on earth was nice to everybody, how much better, easier would things be? Now, is that realistic? Probably not. Okay, it probably isn't. But if we all modeled ourselves after it, could it be a little bit better? Could it be a little more possible? Think about the problems that we come in contact with or that we deal with on a daily basis. A lot of problems are in many cases sort of brought on by ourselves because of the way we deal with people. But if we will deal with each other in the way that we would want to, the natural result is hopefully people are going to be that way to us. So why should I love my neighbor? Well, hopefully to lay a little groundwork for some positive going forward. It provides peace and harmony among all men. You ever prayed for peace? It's a shame we have to, isn't it? We read in the Bible, there would always be wars and rumors of wars. So there's always going to be that kind of stuff, but we still pray for peace. Why do we pray for peace even though we know there probably isn't going to be? It's nice to know that there might be a little bit of peace here and there, right? If we're grading it on a scale, we may not be all the way to here, but it'd be nice to be here. It's better than down here. So that peace and harmony is why we should love our neighbor. Who is our neighbor? Well, it's the person that lives beside us. It's the person that we work with. It's the person in our house. It's the people in public that we come in contact with. Why should I love my neighbor? Because that's all we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Every person that we come in contact with is our neighbor. We are representatives of God here on this earth. If we can't love our neighbors, then we're not showing what God would want us to be. And if we can't love them here, how are we going to love them there? Only question I'd say, tonight we're going to look at, tonight we're going to talk about how to love our enemies. And that gets a little bit tougher, right? It's going to be a little bit more difficult. But right now, let's just go home with this. Let's go home hoping that somehow we'll be better at loving our neighbors going forward than we have been in the past. Every time we come together, we offer an invitation. We offer an opportunity for you to become a Christian. And this is extended each and every time. And it may be something that you've thought about quite often, but you've never done. It might be something that needs to happen today. We can take you into the water, baptize you to become a Christian immediately. It might be something, though, that you have been a Christian or that you've tried in the past and you've sort of fallen away or you've made mistakes. You struggle with loving those neighbors or something that might be like that. That might be something that needs to be fixed or remedied as well. And it might just be something that says, these are things that I struggle with. These are difficulties. These things that have been presented are things that I struggle with. I'm still a Christian. I still am firm in my salvation, but I just need a little help praying for these. It's no shame to admit that we need a little bit of help. Who needed help in the story at the beginning, right? And two people walked right on by. Here's one thing that we can promise. If you come forward, we're going to walk by on the other side. We're going to come right back to you as well. If there's any way we can help you, we'd invite you to come while we stand and sing.